Well, welcome everyone to Aligning Funding Opportunities and Initiatives in California Community Schools Learning Exchange. This is a jump off from our initial webinar that we had that talked about community schools funding and models. Joining us today is Jose Vargas, Policy Manager with the United Way. And also we're able to have Janice Canalen from the Children's Defense Fund here as well. So we're really fortunate to have her join us as well. So thank you so much for joining us. This learning exchange is brought to you by Strategies Technical Assistance and the Office of Child Abuse Prevention. Strategies TA provides technical assistance to child abuse prevention planning teams, county teams, I should say, throughout the state of California. So we help really provide support to different county teams around the state of California as they start to think of child, family, and community wellness. I would like to just bring a couple of features of Zoom to your attention. I know we're all probably Zoom experts by now. I think they should start giving us stock in Zoom since we're on here all so much. But I wanted just to bring a couple of features to your attention in case you forgot. If you want to share or disable your camera, you can click on the little video icon. You'll see it below. Also, if you want to mute or unmute yourself, you can also click the microphone. So we'll have some opportunities for some discussion and questions. If you wanted to communicate with us via chat, or if you had questions for myself or for Anvi, our event coordinator, we'll introduce ourselves in just a minute. You can also use the chat for that as well. Do you want to give a reaction or use the little emoji icons? The reactions icon below will allow you to do that. And actually, it's really cool because they've expanded it. I think they used to only have 4. And I think now that people are using Zoom so much, they've added several, like many. And so it's really cool to be able to use that if you'd like. So here today to support and facilitate for this learning exchange is Anvi Din, our amazing event coordinator, and myself, Lydia Marquez, Senior Technical Assistant Specialist. So if you have any needs today during this learning exchange or questions, or just need us to follow up on anything, please feel free to reach out to us in the chat or even after, and we will be able to help you with that. So again, I want to present Jose. I'm sorry, Janice, I didn't put your picture on here, but I wanted to just give them an opportunity to reintroduce themselves and just chat a little bit about their connection to this work. So I will hand it over to Jose and Janice. I'm not sure who wants to go first.
Thanks, Lydia. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jose Vargas. I am the Education Policy Manager with United Ways of California. I'm sorry I'm not on camera. My internet was a little bit slower than expected today, and I'd rather, be here and able to talk than getting constantly kicked out. So I apologize for that. So a little bit of background before I turn it over to my colleague, Janice. Really our work, here at United Ways of California, as well as the Children's Defense Fund of California, really started around Healthy Start. Healthy Start was such a great program that has existed now for several decades. Really started in the early 90s and gradually evolved into what we today know as community schools. So we really center our work around the best practices that we learned from that and all of the good work that went into that. And then, of course, now we find ourselves in the community schools space. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Janice to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Janice Canalen. I'm with Children's Defense Fund, California. I'm really happy to be here to talk about what Healthy Start has become and how it is now part of community schools, and super excited to be thinking about whole child, whole community wellness and investing in the front end of children's lives. Children's Defense Fund's interest in this is really, we started with trying to find ways to increase access to trauma-informed mental health care. And it really expanded to looking into ways to integrate services in schools and community-based locations. So for us, this is about prevention. It's about building healthy communities. It's about also overcoming deep historical racial inequity and bringing services to children and families in places where they live and work.
Great, thank you so much. And if everyone who is here today wanted to put in the chat your name, where you're from, the county that you are working in, so we could get a little bit of an idea as to the counties that are represented here today. And then while everyone is doing that, I know that there were a few questions that were sent to us to sort of get the conversation going. But before we do that, I just wanted to give everyone here an opportunity to ask questions that you might have regarding community school funding from the webinar. And also if there's any other sort of like things that you might be curious about. So again, feel free, if you feel shy, you can put it in the chat. If you'd like to come on camera and ask the question, you can unmute yourself. Feel free to do whatever feels comfortable for you. So I'll just give everyone a minute. So we have Adam. Hi, Adam. Adam is one of our loyal fans.
I want to learn as much as I can.
I appreciate it. And Wendy too. Welcome back, Wendy. Appreciate you being here. And then anyone have any questions or anything you wanted some clarity around for Janice or Jose?
I have questions, but I wanted to give Wendy or Danielle a chance if they want to ask their own questions first.
Go ahead, Adam.
All right. I was just wondering if there's, maybe I missed it in the last one, if there's been anything new with the kind of eligibility statistics and kind of what exactly they mean, because there's a few different dropout rates and, things like that. And has CDE said what they're, have they put out that exact information about what makes a LEA eligible? I know the list of the categories, but what statistic do they mean? And are they looking just like last year? And given the fact that schools did not have to report it, neither did the state report any statistics last year, kind of what they're going to do with that.
Great question, Adam. I'll take a stab at this first. I would think that it would probably have to come prior to COVID, right? Just because, to your point, right, a lot of counting mechanisms, if you will, for various different groups certainly changed, right, before the pandemic. However, I would be inclined to think that they would want to use whatever counting mechanisms that they might utilize for the state board tracking kind of mechanism that they have as a department, just because that seems to be the most consistent. But I do think, regardless of how they decide to kind of define those specific mechanisms, I do think they want it to be as inclusive as possible, right? Just to not be exclusionary. But that is absolutely something that we need to follow up on.
Okay, thank you. And on the same, and maybe you don't know the answers, but on the same question of, like, I know there's suspensions and expulsions. I couldn't find a count for expulsions. I found suspensions, but is that the same? Is it just kind of the same? One counts suspensions and expulsions together, and also I couldn't find where to find the account of justice involved youth to find out whether a district has more than average amount. That wasn't I don't know if you know where to you can point me in what direction. All the other things I could figure out, like on the dashboard and various CDE statistics, like where to find each of those things. Other than that, I couldn't find justice involved youth account of that.
Yeah,
right,
I don't have a great answer. I do have some colleagues that work on youth justice that would maybe be able to direct you to the most recent statistics. So if that's something that you're really interested in putting in an application, I'm happy to connect you with them so that you can find whatever's
Yeah.
most current.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that we would put in an application. It's more the question of, well, which, if there's a district we're used to working with and we're trying to figure out, are they eligible? Maybe they aren't eligible on these other things, but this might, just be an additional factor that would make them eligible. Just trying to make sure we know what all the factors are. I mean, do you know if CDE is going to put out a list of here are all the schools that fall into one of these, or is it just kind of case by case? Somebody has to kind of present their information and they'll look at it and say, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And now you're accepted.
I'm inclined to think the latter, just because of historically how they've operated.
Right.
I think it's unfortunate um, that the timelines are so constrained overall for the program, right? Because this is one of those spaces where the regional technical assistance centers, right, would be able to just come in and talk about what that looks like, either
They haven't been set up yet,
regionally.
right?
Exactly, right. They're still identifying those regions. So that's kind of one of the issues there, right? I think this first iteration of the process is going to be bumpy, right? But the hope is next year, right, when that kind of second round really begins, that all of that is going to be laid out, and that foundation is going to be there for that
Yeah.
second group.
That's what it feels like. I just didn't know if some of that, I know kind of each week it's kind of, well, CDE has or hasn't kind of released this yet. I know we're looking for the RFPs in spring, which I don't know, that's February, March, April. I don't, maybe these answers will come out along with the RFPs. So.
Although to your point, Adam, I think this is again a really good space for advocates and stakeholders to come in and say, okay, well, these are the benefits, right, and the detriments of using, X, Y, or Z kind of counting mechanism, right? This might be a little bit more exclusionary. This encompasses that number better, right? So I think where possible, we certainly want to, get those conversations, right, get that feedback and share it with the department.
And I think there's probably enough, my personal opinion is there's probably enough options of what would make you eligible that you're going to catch any district that is particularly struggling. So I'm
Right.
not complaining about it. I just like to know exactly.
It's always helpful to have clarification though,
Right.
but absolutely.
Do you, since, unless there's other questions, do you know, I have heard it, among the kind of child welfare field a few times that, that perhaps, a community-based organization can be a lead on a community school, and that might be, kind of if something that we would want to do and kind of step in. Been trying to figure out what exactly does that mean. I personally can imagine that it means that a CBO could do most of the work and kind of bring it to a school district and say, here it is all laid out. You just have to kind of agree and be our partner. Is there any chance that actually the CBO could get could actually be the one that submits and gets the funding and then kind of goes and works with the school? Is there any chance that might be happening? I don't know if you know or have an inclination.
No, but great question. So yes, they can co-lead the application efforts, right? But ultimately that funding is going to reside with the LEA or the county office of Ed. Yes.
Right. I mean, I come out of kind of done stuff in after school, and that's kind of a similar setup where you co-apply, but then kind of the next year, if the school district decides, well, we want to switch it, they have the power to their funding coming in. They could, is it right that a organization and a school could kind of co-apply, but then the school district could decide, oh, you know what, we're not happy with this, or we got a better offer with a different organization, and can switch maybe in the middle of a contract, but maybe in between years. Do you know any of that? I know I'm asking very detailed questions that maybe this is more of a CDE question to be asking, but.
I mean, I think that's a great question. And frankly, that's the first time I've heard that one. Maybe Jose has heard that one before, but that's the first time I've heard that kind of question. And I think that is something, again, that we would want to bring up in our advocacy with CDE to make sure that there's some clarity around that. I think it's definitely an area where there could be some future pitfalls that people aren't considering. So in our conversations, we'll be sure to bring that up.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that is great to just, think about how some of these more traditionally education-led programs could maybe be co-led if we're trying to look at really a community effort. I think about our Magnolia Place site at the Children's Bureau. Like that is a site that I think they do have a preschool program, right? Am I correct,
Yeah.
Adam? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like so excuse me. So it's sort of like already like a baby version of a community school model in some ways because they have a lot of resources there. But to be able to expand something like that in that neighborhood would actually be really would be a really amazing achievement. So
Yeah, there's
one of
obviously there's some obvious places where our
Mhm.
field can fit into the community schools model, especially the kind of the integrated support where we're used to being that hub of here's all the different things, all the different ways that we can help. Let's bring it all together. Let's kind of have the whole group work together as a group. Where I know it's not just like having them all on the same campus, but actually having the different entities talk to each other and plan together. That's kind of a lot of what we do, as well as the kind of family and community engagement is the other piece of kind of at our core. So
Mhm. Yeah. And I think you touched on something that I think is really important. And it's like, how can we make this easier for families so they're not having to, maybe physically they might have to go to different places, but at least we can help, guide them through these different systems. And I know that for many of our teams that we are working with in prevention, we're looking at, how do we create these systems that are more cohesive, that are really talking to each other, that are working together. And I think one of the things on the work that we're doing is how do you actually approach it from a community, family, child wellness? Like you're talking about wellness, because when you say you come from the perspective of you're talking about child abuse prevention, people can get really turned off even by those words. They're like, wait a minute, I'm not abusing my child. Why do I need to engage in this? This is for people, but it's like the potential is there if you're stressed, if you don't have enough food, if something happens in your family, like the potential is there for many people. When I used to train, I used to always tell the story of, I was somebody who had many years of early childhood education. I actually was an infant toddler teacher. I had my own child and I'm like, what the heck am I doing? What am I doing? What do I do with this child? I remember the day my husband and I came home from the hospital. I said, what do we do with this baby? And I swear, I've never seen someone look so scared in their life. He was like, but you're the expert. Isn't this what you do for your job? And I'm like, I know, but what do I do with this baby? And it's like, I think that how do we have a space for families who are in those vulnerable places, regardless of, what their income is, what their situations are, and look at it from this very big community-wide scope. So definitely, I think some great points. So thank you so much for your questions, Adams. I think it brings up these larger ideas of how do we sort of make this a community-wide approach? Like, what are some of the ways in which we can do that? So I don't know if maybe Wendy had any comments around that.
I mean, I can certainly jump in here if that's okay. I mean, this is what we really have been very excited about and have really hopeful. And Lydia, honestly, we had the very same conversation at our house when we brought our baby home. I've been working in children's health for 10 years or something, and this baby felt very different. But I think there are a number of models around wellness. There are a number of things that Healthy Start historically did by having a coordinator to kind of take the burden off of teachers to identify needs in families. So you can look at it from that perspective, that it is this, pro teacher, pro family way of identifying children and getting them the services that their whole family might need to help the child be successful in school. So that's, I think, one example is having kind of a coordinator on site, having a coordinator there. Another is a promotoris model where community leaders are actively working with families to find out their needs and connecting them with services. That's sort of another one. Another model I think we've seen is kind of the after school model where the community-based organization is working to provide services that the school district isn't or can't. So, you know, and they're working in collaboration with each other to provide services after school and connecting families to resources that way. And the other thing I think we've been thinking about, and you have mentioned early childhood, is that we're really talking about kind of blanketing communities from birth to graduation and giving families everything that they need to be successful, and that the community is really capable of finding those services and connecting them. So some of those, I think, talking points are really helpful to get away from the child abuse prevention kind of language that I think is off. I think you're right, is off-putting for families. And you know, the point of this legislation and the point of our work with Healthy Start is to, again, you know, coming from the CDF perspective, and I know United Way shares this concern also, is that we're trying to find ways to end generations of poverty by connecting families to trauma-informed mental health care, and all the services that support creating a healthy home for a child to go back home to every day.
Yeah, that's great. And Wendy mentioned she works in Butte County, which is, you know, the northern part of the state, and mentioned that they are, you know, trying to establish FRCs in school sites, which I've seen that as I've done work is, you know, I've seen where schools are able to, you know, have an FRC on site where it's like a teacher knows, hey, I've got this family that needs a connection for food, or we have families, I think we might have mentioned this before, but basically we have had you know, families that I've worked with who have younger siblings that they're like, what do I do with this you know, younger sibling? And there's like a mommy and me music class, so they drop their older child off at school and they're able to engage in that. So it's just I think a way for families to, you know, not have to pull all these strings, but to still have these enriching experiences. So I think that is a great way to even I think make that connection to more of this community school model without having to do too, you know, sometimes that can be tricky. So that, I think that's kind of can be a first start.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've seen some of these examples kind of come up where services are available that could be child abuse prevention. There's, you know, positive parenting and those kinds of things that can be offered, but it can just be part of the many services that that are trying to be coordinated through this effort. I'll stop there. Jose, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to circle back really quickly back to that kind of language conversation, right? So, you know, there are certain connotations, right? When folks think about child abuse, which I think is, you know, why it's so important to, um, you know, see it from the lens of stress, toxic stress, and trauma, right? You know, that child abuse, for example, right, doesn't necessarily uh, have to mean that it's, you know, within the family. It can also be, you know, at school, or amongst the child themselves, right? And I think, you know, with adverse childhood experiences, right, that word, that terminology, is just really encompassing. And I think there's a lot of good work that, you know, the Surgeon General in her office is doing on that, and really ensuring that that's inclusive as possible, right? So, you know, for example, adverse childhood experiences really historically has had maybe like 6 categories, right? Uh, but, you know, similar to how we define poverty, right, we know that there are, certain things, certain instances, certain traits that have kind of been left out when talking about these terminologies. For example, um, racism, right? Racism is an adverse childhood experience, maybe not by literal category, but we know that experiencing those things can lead to certain types of trauma, right? Financial instability, right? That also historically has not been one of the direct categories that falls under the scope of adverse childhood experiences, but we know, right, that a child that experiences financial instability, right, is also, a lot more likely to experience, hunger insecurity, violence at the home, um, you know, a plethora of other things that come along with that, right? So I think part of it is also, trying to ensure that, these categories, these definitions are going to, accurately affect the populations that are being affected, right? And I think at least in terms of, our long-term vision that, we'd like to see with community schools is really a more intentional approach with regards to adverse childhood experiences, to toxic stress, right? So, the Surgeon General and her office's work around both of those things really centers around um, identification and screenings of ACEs, right? Now, there's nothing wrong with that, right? That's really important, but I think, especially with Healthy Start, something that we learned is really around the consequences, right? Unintentional as they might be, around the over pathologizing of children, right? Which is something that we see in other areas and in other programs. And I think with, Healthy Start in now community schools is really, talking about how do we ensure that, one, these models and these programs can serve as that, one-stop resource center for all things that a family and student might need, right? And I think, with ACEs specifically, it's about, well, we don't currently, right, have a mechanism whereby, we can refer children and families once they have been screened, and once it's been identified that they have these traumas, right, that they've experienced, certain abuses. And it's just thinking about, certainly at the local level, right, how to, align programs and services and supports, but also big picture, right? Thinking about how, different departments should interact with one another, and hold the space to have these conversations, right? So specific to community schools, I know there's discussions about creating a council that's kind of going to help oversee implementation statewide for that program. But I think, a part of that council really should be, various departments that impacts a child's and a family's life, right? The types of programs and services that are housed in non-education related spaces, right? HHS, Department of Social Services, and so on and so forth. I think, ultimately, if we really want to break down these silos that are happening locally in our communities, then we have to ensure that the community leaders that are kind of leading these efforts, right, locally, are going to be heard at the state level, right? Because it might be helpful to break these silos down locally, but if nothing's being done statewide, then we know this is going to be perpetrated through the rest of the state. And then it's just going to be a counteracting force, if you will, to our communities and the good work that's being done in so many different spaces, right? But also potentially for community schools, which is, barely going to be up and running, right? We want to ensure that these types of problems and issues are going to be identified and addressed in an ongoing fashion, right? Not just identified early on and then, some type of evaluation towards the end of whatever the program might look like.
Yeah, I think you touched on something that I think is really also important as, new funding's coming down and perhaps some of the folks here today or some of the folks even watching later, will be part of these efforts to get these models going and these newer this reimagining of some of these systems and programs is, how do you create an equitable system that's working for all members of the community? I think that what happens, what we might see when it comes to racial equity is, a program might say, well, we need to have that, but what we're going to do is put it on everyone who's in the community's behavior, but not think about that system and how it's working and how it's impacting folks. So I think that's just something for us to just always remember and keep in the forefront, is that when we are part of having discussions around creating these systems or reimagining these systems, that is actually should be a cornerstone in the discussions and in the ideas and the work, is making sure that the system itself is equitable, that we're making sure we are letting the community really lead the efforts, especially if we're not part of that community. I, for one, am someone that bumps in and out of all these different communities. I'm part of some, but not of others. And so the experts of the community are the people that live there. And those are the folks that really need to be leading. So just something for all of us to keep in mind, I guess. But I want to I don't know if anyone has anything else around that, but I have another question that someone emailed me that they wanted asked. But
I was just going to add that, that is kind of the heart of why CDF really fell in love with the Healthy Start model, and now the community schools model, that there's just a lot for communities to design for themselves. And there's a lot that they can address and prioritize. And this just really gives some guardrails and some tools so that they can do it well. But that, keeping that at the forefront, I think, is really important. And I think it's, really key on the racial equity, and also trauma and some of the other things that we've talked about.
yeah, that's so important, and it's just a great reminder. So I know that Janice, when we were having a little warm-up conversation, we talked a little bit about investment and prevention, and I just think some of the things you said were just like very good reminders, and I think good considerations for when we're starting to have these conversations and advocate even for some of the funding.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I think is really important for us in the way that we discuss this among ourselves and with the communities that we're hoping will pick up some of these programs is to really encourage them, really encourage ourselves to push this model in a way that we are investing in the front end of children's lives and not on our collective's community failures through incarceration and punishment. What we're trying to do is, really shift the way that we invest in children and families, and heavily investing and putting resources in on the front end of lives instead of the back end of our failures.
Yeah, that is so important, and that's such a great point. I actually saw this statistic. It was actually for New York, excuse me, New York City, but it just kind of gives you an idea. But in 1 year, they spent $358,000 to house an inmate in their local jail. And think about, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of folks incarcerated in just even a single county. And you start to think about all of the money that can be spent on families and making sure they're well. And I think sometimes the connection isn't always made to that. So it's always like, well, there's something wrong if people are incarcerated. We need to kind of hold them here, and families are here in a different, but it's like, this is all connected. How do we put more money on the front end so that is, we see less and less of that, right?
Yeah, I think this is a really important conversation for all of us to have. And I think there's a lot of historical precedent, which is that the disability movement, the idea of deinstitutionalizing people, and investing more in community resources so that they can live in their homes was, really a popular, successful model in a lot of ways. So, and this is really it's in some ways sort of similar that when you give people resources and support them to thrive, you don't need to ultimately punish them because they have what they need. So, I think what we're trying to do is invest in these resources that are available in communities so that families can make the most of them.
Right, that's right. I know that there was another question that was just asking about how the United Way and Children's Defense Fund are connected to the community schools funding. And so I know that there was some folks that were curious about that. So I'm not sure if both you and Jose want to speak a bit to that.
Now, when they say connected to the funding, is that specific in regards to if we operate models, like have we applied for the funding before previously, or in terms of, what role we've played in the establishment and allocation of the funding? Sorry, I don't think I understand the question.
Yeah, I think the second part, like, if you're connected to any kind of like the allocation or has it been advocacy?
Right. So I think this is a two-part answer, and Janice, feel free to add in anything I missed. But I think, again, our work really began on Healthy Start about 3.5 years ago, and trying to reintroduce and modernize that. Initially, our proposal requested 60 million over 4 years. And then, of course, COVID certainly complicated a lot of things, one of which was that proposal. Ultimately, we had to scale that down to 5 to 10 million, which probably would have created just a handful of re-envisioned sites for Healthy Start. Now, ultimately, we didn't get that request granted. So we came back with a third version of our Healthy Start bill. And of course, there at the same time, there was this parallel work going on in the community school space by several community schools coalition. Um, you know, they were requesting funds for community schools, and at the same time we were requesting funds for our Healthy Start. And then of course a lot of legislators and partners, right, started to see the connections between Healthy Start and community schools. And so towards the end of this summer, the policy framework that we had created for our Healthy Start program was adopted and attached to the legislature's $2.8 billion investment for community schools specific, right? So I would say, a large part of kind of our role, right, revolves around the policy for the community schools program. Obviously, we were supportive of the budget allocation as well, but just trying to be cognizant of the support really from organizations and coalitions in that space for the last 2 years. So I think it was just at one point, right, a lot of the good work that was happening on these two fronts just merged. And then, we find ourselves in a really fortunate circumstance where, both sides got what they wanted, and just, really excited and happy for our communities and what this is going to mean for them.
Yeah, and I think our ongoing role has to do with advocacy and continued advocacy around how this program is implemented. And I think we will collectively, Jose and I both will continue to try to have the conversation to move things towards service integration. That is our piece, I think, of this discussion. And also the piece around trauma-informed mental health care, that's sort of always part of how this investment gets worked out. And that was the part that we, I think, feel strongly about, that we contributed to the legislative win that we got for this funding. So we're going to continue to talk about how to make this program look more like sort of the model that we had in mind, with kind of a modernized Healthy Start.
Great, thank you so much. I think that, the fact that you're just really sharing this information with everyone and really sort of advocating for, all the communities really in our state to be able to have access to this funding is so helpful. We have about 15 minutes, and I want to spend some time just really sort of picking your brains around, as we begin to think about, family child wellness / prevention, how could you see community-based organizations getting involved in this community school model? And maybe I'm speaking a little bit more to the ones that haven't traditionally been considered as part of that. So I'm just wondering, if you were, like a community-based organization, how would you approach getting involved or connected to a site? And in either one, I'm not sure who wants to go first.
I think this is one of those questions that's also a two-part answer, right? I think, again, because this is really centered around schools specifically and them applying the model, it would be, one, reaching out to, schools in the vicinity, and one, asking them if they know that this funding is available, right? And then two, maybe talking a little bit more about the program and what that funding would entail, and how they can, work together. And I think the second part, right, is a similar conversation, but with their partners, right? So having a conversation with other CBOs and saying, hey, this is, a really good opportunity for our community. And, we can all, one, a lot of the times we know that they're already filling in, a gap or playing a role in their community. So it's just a matter of aligning it, right, with that program and with that proposal. So really making sure that they're going to be at the table speaking amongst themselves. And then at some point, right, merging those two conversations between community leaders, community partners, and then the school and or schools that are interested in the program, right? So I think a lot of it begins with just really those initial conversations with partners and schools in terms of this opportunity itself. And then after that, right, it's when it gets a little bit more intentional, a little bit more focused in terms of what that blueprint would ultimately look like for the program itself.
Good follow up on that. You mentioned other CBOs that are out there. What I naturally think of after school organizations, school-based healthcare centers and federally qualified health centers. Are there other types of other fields, other natural place people who are thinking they're going to be, they are natural fits to be part of the community school model that we should also be thinking of?
Absolutely. So I think my my politician answer would be, it would depend, right, on what the local community needs are, right? And I think a more practical answer would be as many as possible, right? I think, when thinking about what needs might be in a particular community, that should help lead those conversations. I think in terms of natural fits, right? Certainly family resource centers, right? I think, historically, they've always played a role in these types of programs and models, are really starting even probably before Healthy Start, as we saw kind of the natural, evolutions of Healthy Start programs, creating FRCs or FRCs merging into, Healthy Start programs. So certainly there, I think, with this latest kind of model of community schools is really an emphasis around early care and education. As Janice pointed out, really ensuring that it's going to be a kind of birth to 12 continuum of care. And, when talking about that, I would just say, any and all partners around the early care and education space who are able to, really help around this program. And again, going back to the presentation itself, it sounds scary, but I think a lot of the groundwork, a lot of the foundational work is already happening, right? A lot of it's just individualized or siloed, right? We know that the work is being done by certain organizations. It's just a matter of coalescing all of that great work that's going on, really to ensure that everyone's on the same page in terms of, goals and vision for the community. But yeah, I don't think there's, quote unquote, a specific type of CBO. I would say the more the merrier, right? I think at some point, of course, that becomes a little bit more difficult when, trying to have these conversations at one table, right? If you have, for example, 40 partners or 50 partners, not all of them might be able to make whatever kind of local councils established in those meetings. But I think even if there are intermittent discussions in terms of goals and priorities, I think, the more the merrier.
Yeah, and I'll just add that we're always sort of learning and seeing new ways that communities are trying to integrate these services for families. One thing we hadn't thought about before was I hadn't thought about before was legal aid for students and families that have a high immigrant population. There's a school that we're going to go and visit. We're going to be at next week in Oakland that has a really high immigration population, and a lot of their students are involved in deportation procethere's some schools have students that are parents, and so there are support services that are available in the community there. There's a lot of things that I'm constantly being sort of shown how to put into a community schools model. Another idea that I ran into recently was children of incarcerated parents. We did a little sort of human-centered design about what programs would look like for them that they would be interested in attending, and what came out of that was community gardening because they wanted to give back to their community. So I think that these are the kind of conversations that need to happen at the community level, and those are the kind of partners, really thinking broadly about who can be at the table and what each of those agencies can provide, and what they can really gain in terms of providing services that haven't been considered before through connecting it through a school site or even an after-school program. So, and then the other example that we always talk about, or we frequently talk about, is RISE in Richmond. They are kind of a national model now in terms of after-school programming, so I'm sure you probably have run into them. But they do a lot of group and mental health therapies. So, and they take on a lot of extra sort of overflow from the school district. So some of those partners that can kind of manage caseloads and fill in the gaps where school districts are unable to have the wherewithal to do that themselves. Those kind of partners can really fill in a lot of gaps for families.
Yeah, it's like really thinking outside of the box. I read an article last year about a school that actually decided to have free washer, like a free laundry room for families. And actually it ended up reducing the reports for neglect that they were having to make because, kids coming to school and clothes that were not clean because the parents could not afford laundry. And if you live in an apartment, you know how expensive it can get, especially if you have a lot of family members. So they installed these to just kind of like really help. I think there was a couple students that the principal was like, I can't see this happening. So he was able to secure some funding and had a little closet that wasn't really being used, and pretty soon found that there was a lot of families who ended up using it. At the same time, noticed his teacher started to comment that they were seeing less and less kids coming to school in clothes that were not clean. And so I think that's right there is it's not simple. It's not simple, especially when that's an expense, but it is another strategy in reducing child abuse. And so I think that there are so many ways we can make these connections. And again, I think Janice and even Jose, the point that you're making is really, what does the community say? What does the community need? Because I think one model will not fit all. And I think that's just another great reminder. All right. Well, I think that we are getting close to our time, but I wanted to make sure that if anyone had any other questions or comments, that we left a few minutes for that.
I have a question of my own for folks that are here. I don't know if that's allowed, but I think I
Go ahead.
would ask, how many of you are, seriously considering, pursuing this funding and this type of model, or maybe, you have partners that have, brought it up to you and would like to work on it. So I'm just curious to see where folks are on that.
I'd say for us, we're seriously knowing that this is something we should seriously consider, and seriously, trying to get as much information and be able to have those conversations with school districts and whatever partners that make sense to bring it together to, like, it's whether or not it actually will work out with any of them, whether or not it, if it's LUSD, they probably already have, like, whole community school thing set up, but that's where it's at least at that level that we know we definitely need to seriously think about this and maybe do it, and it's a natural fit for us, because of the stuff we talked about. And it's funny when I asked about different groups and you said FRCs, I kind of think of FRCs as part of our field, like that's already us. But yeah.
And then Wendy put in the chat, this is everything we've been discussing as we look to establish FRCs. So it's encouraging to hear we want FRCs that are for the community and of the community they serve and address overall wellness of families. So that's great, because I think it looks like Butte County is looking at that. And I know there's several other counties that are really trying to leverage their FRCs to really support families in school settings. But I think it's just the engagement of other maybe community-based organizations that we need to really start advocating for. One thing I wanted to ask Jose before we left, and Janice, is if folks wanted to get in touch with someone locally, what might be a suggestion? And then the other part of this too is, are there any community school sites that you could recommend in terms of just like seeing what that actually looks like in action? So if people, are in the stages, as Adam kind of described, of like discovering like how they can get connected to this, that they could at least see something and a model of what it looks like in action in real life. In real life.
Absolutely. So again, this is one of those two-part answers. The first one being that, there are a handful, right, that received community schools funding from the last iteration of grants. And CD has a list of those. I think it's probably like 10, probably no more than like 15. And that's on their website. We can go ahead and share that list out. But we also know, right, too, there are community schools models that are CBO led, right? So there's not necessarily a list for those, if you will. But absolutely, I think there are, a couple of community school models and Healthy Start models, believe it or not, that, still operate. And we can absolutely share their information in terms of, what you're doing that works, that doesn't work as well, right? But yeah, I think certainly this next grant funding, that list is going to exponentially grow, I would imagine.
Yeah, that'd be great. So we can send that out in the follow-up email. So we'll send the recording link and then we can send that resource out as well. Did you have anything you wanted to add, Janice?
No, I mean, I just off the top of my head, just the few things that we mentioned. Certainly, RISE is a healthy start model that kind of continues in this climate and has those connections that we're talking about, sort of after school, working with the school district, working with local school-based health clinics. That's one model. Another one that we mentioned is in Oakland. Oakland Tech has a school-based health center, and then we're also in conversation now with Oakland International High School that has the high rate of immigrant families that I mentioned, and then Jose has been really helpful in connecting us through United Ways with Lindsay Unified in the Central Valley. So we have some kind of urban rural diversity in the way that we are thinking about these programs.
Great, thank you. Well, I appreciate everyone's time here today, and especially Jose and Janice. Thank you so much for just sharing this wealth of information. I think this is such a great connection that our the teams we support and also the other folks who are here today can use to really connect to expand, that net of support and safety for families in the community. So hopefully we have some conversations that get started, some connections that can be made. We'll be sure to send out the list of different sites that are currently operating, as well as any other additional information that may be helpful to all. We want you to stay connected to us, so please follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. We also have a YouTube channel. This will actually be put on our YouTube channel, so please look for it if you wanted to rewatch it. And then also you can always sign up for our newsletter at Strategies. It's CA for California.org. Let's see, I think Anvi, our events coordinator, will drop a link for our Survey Monkey into into the chat. So if you get a moment, you can fill that out and let us know how this session was. If you don't have the time to do that today, I will go ahead and send that in the follow-up email, which I'll be receiving. And also, we have a lot of webinars planned for this coming year, and our next webinar will be around looking at prevention. I think as a community, like how do we sort of start to look at prevention, not just as a child welfare, child abuse prevention planning council thing, but as a community-wide effort. So that's sort of, the way that prevention is starting to head. And that includes things like community schools. So we're really excited to kind of like wrap this all up with a nice little bow to start our new year off. So please just look out for that as well. So again, thank you everyone. I appreciate you all being here, and we will hopefully see you again soon.